He took the spotlight, the money, and my future, all while smiling. The morning it happened, I was stirring burnt coffee when I heard my name, spoken with the kind of fake politeness people use right before they twist the knife. My manager wasn't just bad-mouthing me, he was rewriting my achievements in real time, handing my victories to himself like I was nothing more than background noise. The humiliation hit hard, but beneath it was something steadier, quieter, certainty. Because while he was busy performing, I was busy documenting everything he thought I'd never prove. If you've ever had your work stolen, subscribe and share your experience in the comments. I was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my manager, Brennan Cole. I answered without thinking, expecting another task dumped on me before I'd even settled in for the day. Instead, what poured through the speaker made my hand freeze midair. "Oaklynn's dependable, sure," Brennan said, his voice drifting in and out like he was walking. "But she doesn't have the instincts for higher-level strategy. Solid worker, not a leader." I stood there in the Skybridge lounge, the city glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun casting a harsh shine on everything except the sudden darkness tightening in my chest. I realized quickly he didn't know I'd picked up. This was a pocket dial, a mistake, one he'd never have made if he knew I was listening. He continued chuckling as someone on the other end murmured something I couldn't hear. "I mean, she executes, I'll give her that, but she's not the type you move up. No presence, no vision. Clients respond to confidence, you know?" My throat burned. Not from anger. Anger requires surprise. This I'd learned to expect. This was the same man who nodded at me in meetings, then repeated my points 10 minutes later with the confidence of someone who believed he'd invented them. The same man who dismissed my concerns, then presented them as his insights to the executive team. I'd known how he operated. I just hadn't expected to hear the script spoken out loud. I lowered the phone slowly, listening to him reducing me to a checklist of limitations while sipping the cold coffee I'd suddenly lost the taste for. The lounge smelled like roasted beans and office carpet cleaner, a scent I used to associate with routine. Now it felt like the odor of stagnation. I ended the call, not with dramatic flair, not with trembling fingers. Just a quiet press of my thumb, as if I'd simply hung up on a wrong number. I leaned against the window and let the city noise below steady me. Traffic, construction, sirens, everything kept moving, even as something in me shifted. I walked back to my desk in the open workspace of Northcrest Capital advisors, weaving past people who didn't know my entire view of the place had changed in the last 60 seconds. When I sat down, my chair squeaked the same way it always did, but the sound felt sharper, more pointed. I opened my laptop, not to check emails or skim the day's priorities, but to open something I hadn't looked at in a few weeks. The ledger. My ledger. 4 years of clients, contracts, negotiated terms, renewals, expansions, all logged meticulously. Not because I'd planned for revenge or imagined needing proof. I did it because I'd watched people like Brennan succeed by rewriting the truth, and I'd decided a long time ago that the only protection I had was the kind I built myself. Row after row, column after column, the numbers told a story he didn't know I possessed. As I scrolled, the weight of his words settled into something colder, steadier, almost clinical. Brennan thought he was untouchable. He thought he could define my value in private while profiting off my work in public, but he had no idea just how much I had recorded, and he had no idea how easily the truth could break a man who built his entire career on other people's silence. When I first started at Northcrest, I didn't plan on becoming the quiet historian of every deal that passed through our team. It began during my second month when I watched a colleague, bright, sharp, overprepared, get sidelined as Brennan took a victory lap for a contract she had practically hand-delivered to him. I remember the way she swallowed her frustration, the way her face tightened into a polite smile, the way everyone pretended not to notice. That was the moment something settled in me. Not bitterness, but clarity. If I wanted any record of my work to survive the office politics swirling around us, I'd have to create it myself. So I did. Not obsessively, not out of paranoia, but out of quiet discipline. At first, the ledger was simple. a way to track clients, follow-ups, contract cycles. But as I watched more credit slip upward and sideways, as I sat in meetings where my contributions were acknowledged with nods while Brennan's were praised with bonuses, the ledger evolved. I added timestamps, attachments, negotiation notes, client preferences, obstacles overcome. Every deal had a story, and I documented each one with the kind of precision I knew no one else cared enough to attempt. Over 4 years, it grew into something bigger than I'd expected, a comprehensive map of everything I'd built, and everything Brennan had taken. I never called it evidence. It wasn't created for war, it was created for survival. As I scrolled through the sheet that morning, the numbers felt heavier than they ever had. I wasn't just looking at accounts and revenue. I was looking at time I'd invested, late nights I'd put in after everyone else logged off, negotiations I'd salvaged at the 11th hour, clients who trusted me because I showed up when Brennan didn't bother. Year 1 was all hustle. A dozen accounts turned profitable, 8 new clients, 2 renewals that Brennan barely acknowledged unless it benefited him. Year 2, faster, stronger, a few big wins I'd fought tooth and nail for, deals that shifted from unlikely to secured because I'd refused to let them die in the pipeline. Year 3, expansion, larger portfolios, higher stakes, and Brennan's shadow growing longer across my work, inch by inch. By year 4, he barely attempted to hide it. He would step into conversations I'd nurtured for months and proclaim final stage confidence as though he'd shepherded them from start to finish. The ledger captured every discrepancy, dates where I'd initiated contact months before he claimed involvement, revenue attributed to him that showed my initials in every draft, closed deals with email chains where clients addressed me directly, thanking me for pushing things through. Still, none of that prepared me for the cold calculation I felt after his pocket dial. I had always seen the ledger as my insurance, a way to keep my truth uncorrupted. But now, as the morning light hit my screen and Brennan's words echoed in my ears, it transformed into something else, a boundary line, a quiet declaration that I wasn't going to let someone rewrite my story without a fight. I closed the spreadsheet and sat back, feeling my heartbeat begin to steady. The office hummed around me, keyboards tapping, phones ringing, forced laughter drifting from the break area. Everyone had learned to live with the imbalance, the inequity, the quiet theft baked into the culture. But I wasn't sure I could anymore. I didn't need revenge. I didn't even need validation. What I needed was the truth, preserved in a way no one could erase. And as I looked at the ledger, the sheer weight of what I had tracked, I realized something Brennan hadn't considered for a single second. The person he dismissed as harmless had been documenting every step of his ascent, and I was just beginning to understand the power of that. By the time 2 p.m. rolled around, the entire floor felt unsettled. Brennan never called a full team meeting unless he had something to brag about, usually a win he barely contributed to. Still, everyone filed into the strategy war room, the long glass table reflecting the overhead lights, the air thick with that familiar mix of ambition and exhaustion. I took a seat halfway down the table, close enough to see the screen, but far enough not to look like I was trying to be noticed. Not that it mattered. Brennan only noticed people when it benefited him. He walked in a minute later, carrying his 4th Street coffee cup like a prop, tie loosened just enough to signal he'd been working hard all day. He flashed the room a practiced smile. "Great quarter, team," he said, clicking the remote as the first slide illuminated the wall-size screen. Revenue charts, percentage growth, color-coded achievements. By all appearances, the best quarter we'd had in years. I scanned the list once, then again, my stomach tightening with each line. The Mason Group, Hawthorne Analytics, Rydell Packaging, Harper & Vale. Every account shown under Brennan's name, every single one, was mine. Deals I had sourced, negotiated, repaired, and finalized. Deals where he hadn't even been copied on the early email chains. Deals he'd only stepped into once the contracts were nearly finished. The room buzzed with enthusiasm. Someone clapped. Another person murmured, "Huge numbers." Brennan nodded as if he were humbly accepting a compliment he absolutely felt he deserved. "It took strong leadership and strategic foresight," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "But together, we delivered an outstanding quarter." Together, interesting choice of word for someone who'd quietly erased everyone else's fingerprints from the board. He clicked to the next slide. "With these wins, our total new business for the year clocks in at just over 46 million. Another murmur, louder this time. I stared at the number, my pulse beating in my ears. I knew that figure intimately. I had built 38 million of it myself. 38 million. More than 4/5 of his supposed contribution. He kept presenting as if nothing in the room was wrong, as if the truth wasn't sitting under his nose in the form of the woman he insisted had no leadership potential. Then he dropped the real announcement. "I'm honored to share that I've been selected for the Apex Circle Award this year." A few people gasped, some smiled. One person whispered, "That's huge." Huge was an understatement. The Apex Circle wasn't just a trophy or a plaque. It came with a cash award approaching $1 million, nearly $1 million, tied to numbers I had generated. I watched him soak in the attention, his grin widening just slightly when his eyes met mine. And in that split second, I saw it. Recognition. Not guilt. Not even close. Brennan knew exactly what he'd done. He just never imagined I would challenge it. Applause spread around the table, and I joined in, my palms tapping softly against one another. I had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to protect yourself was to appear compliant until the moment compliance no longer served you. Brennan's shoulders relaxed when he saw me clapping. He took it as confirmation that I was the same quiet worker he'd always been able to step over without resistance. But while the room celebrated him, I wasn't thinking about the humiliation. I was thinking about the ledger waiting on my laptop, about the untouched documentation he assumed didn't exist, about the narrative he believed he controlled. And as he wrapped up the meeting, thanking everyone for trusting his leadership, I felt something cold and resolute form inside me. This wasn't disappointment anymore. It was decision. Because in that moment, as he stood basking in the glow of a spotlight built on my labor, I realized something he never would. The higher he climbed on work that wasn't his, the harder he would fall when the truth surfaced. And I had every piece of that truth documented. That night, after the applause faded and the office emptied, I sat alone at my kitchen table with nothing but my laptop screen and the low hum of the refrigerator to keep me company. The city outside my window had quieted into that restless stillness. Only late-night streets carry, cars passing in occasional waves, horns distant, the glow of streetlights pooling on the pavement. I should have been exhausted. Instead, I felt wired in a way that didn't come from caffeine or adrenaline. It came from clarity, the kind that arrives after you finally see someone for who they really are. I opened the ledger again, but instead of scrolling through it like I had earlier, I created a fresh document, a blank sheet waiting to become something more powerful than Brennan could ever anticipate. This wouldn't be a simple record. It would be a blueprint, a map of everything he'd taken and everything I'd done to keep the department afloat while he made victory laps off my accomplishments. I began with color coding, green for accounts where he genuinely contributed. There weren't many, just a handful, and even those leaned heavily on support from the team. Yellow for deals where he hovered around the edges, offering leadership after the hard parts were done. Red for everything I sourced, nurtured, negotiated, repaired, and closed without him in sight. By the time I finished sorting the past 4 years, the spreadsheet looked like a heat map of someone else's ambition, one soaked in my labor. Then I opened my email archives, dozens of threads where clients addressed me directly, negotiation drafts with my initials in every track change, follow-up sent late at night from my personal device when a deal threatened to unravel. I added a notes column in the new document, tying each account to the messages that proved the truth. The more I typed, the more a sense of purpose solidified. Not revenge, not anger, just accuracy, something Brennan had never cared about. Around midnight, I pushed back from the table and stretched my aching shoulders. But I wasn't done, not yet. I added a new sheet, bonus eligibility by quarter. Using the company handbook's criteria, I calculated exactly how much revenue Brennan had claimed from my work. The numbers weren't just high, they were staggering. He had built nearly his entire performance narrative on deals he barely touched. For 4 years, he had collected recognition, prestige, and fat compensation packages off the illusion that he was the driving force behind everything our team produced. I knew the truth. My ledger knew the truth. But leadership? They'd only seen what he curated. So I built one more section, a simple, concise summary formatted like a handoff document. Objective, professional, no accusations, just facts laid out cleanly with references anyone could verify. If someone in leadership reviewed it, they'd see the pattern within seconds. But patterns only mattered when someone bothered to look. At 3 a.m., I exported the file to a PDF, saved it twice, once to my drive, once to an encrypted folder I rarely used, and closed my laptop. My apartment felt cold, but the stillness around me was comforting in a strange way. This wasn't a declaration of war. This was preparation. Brennan had spent years performing confidence while collecting credit. I had spent years doing the work while recording every detail. He assumed I was harmless because I didn't make noise. He mistook quiet for weakness, consistency for submission. But as I slipped the printed pages into a manila envelope hours later, 47 of them, each one precise and irrefutable, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit until that moment. I had outbuilt him. Not outmaneuvered, not outtalked, outbuilt. My work, my discipline, my documentation stood taller than all the shortcuts he'd taken, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming. I arrived at the office early the next morning, long before anyone else drifted in with half-finished coffees and the kind of sleepy resignation people carry into a job they've stopped believing in. My steps echoed down the quiet hallway as I walked toward Brennan's office with the envelope tucked under my arm. The manila paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of those 47 pages wasn't paper, but everything he'd built on lies. His office door, as usual, was unlocked, a habit he never bothered to break, no matter how many security notices warned him otherwise. I placed the envelope dead center on his desk, perfectly aligned with the edge, and stepped back. For a moment, I imagined his face when he opened it. Shock, maybe, denial, panic. I didn't want to humiliate him. I just wanted the truth documented where he couldn't pretend not to see it. Then I walked out. By the time he arrived, the floor had filled with its usual rhythm. Keyboards clacking, calls being answered, people saying good morning without meaning it. I heard his door open before I even looked up. He whistled, off-key as always, then went silent. A few seconds passed. Then I heard footsteps. "Really, Oaklynn?" he said. His voice was light, amused, dripping with the careless confidence of someone convinced the world bends in his direction. I turned in my chair as he approached, holding the still-sealed envelope between two fingers, like it was a birthday card he had no interest in reading. He dropped it onto my keyboard. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you want to leave?" he said, smirking. "I hope your next job appreciates your attention to detail." People nearby pretended not to watch. No one breathed. I didn't give him what he wanted. No reaction, no argument. I simply picked up the envelope and set it beside my laptop. If he wasn't going to open it, then he wasn't going to see the truth. So I'd just have to put it somewhere he couldn't ignore. At 9:48 a.m., I sent one email. To Brennan, CC, CFO Marina Caldwell, HR Director Elliot Granger. Subject, Transition Documentation for Review. I attached the PDF, the complete blueprint of 4 years of work, color-coded, cross-referenced, impossible to dismiss. My hand shook slightly as I hit send, but not from fear, from finality, from choosing myself. I went to refill my coffee. When I returned 5 minutes later, Marina's reply waited in my inbox. "Received, will review." Those 3 quiet words held more power than Brennan had shown me in 4 years. 40 minutes later, Brennan called me into his office. The amusement was gone. His face was flushed, jaw tight, the pages of my printed documentation scattered across his desk now that he'd finally bothered to open the envelope. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" he demanded. "A transition document," I said calmly. "So the next person handling these accounts has the full client history." "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped. "This is a hit job. You're trying to sabotage me because you're upset you weren't promoted." I kept my voice level. "Everything in that file is accurate. Email trails, timelines, contract versions. Anyone can verify it." "Half these deals were team efforts," he said, flipping through pages with shaking hands. "You're rewriting history." "No," I said. "I'm recording it." His phone rang then. He ignored it. It rang again. He snatched it up. "Yes?" A long pause. His eyes flicked to mine. "I can explain the methodology," he said, forcing a steady tone. Another pause. "No, the list isn't accurate. She's misrepresenting her involvement." His voice tightened. "Yes, I'll come up." He hung up and exhaled sharply. "Marina wants to see us, now." I followed him to the executive floor, where the air always smelled like expensive carpet and polished wood instead of office cleaner. Marina sat at her desk with my file open on her screen. Elliot from HR waited beside her. What happened next wasn't dramatic, not on the surface. It was quiet, clinical, methodical. Marina asked for explanations. Brennan offered excuses. She asked for documentation. He couldn't produce any. She asked me questions. I answered with dates, client messages, and verifiable facts. With every response, Brennan's world shrank by an inch. By the time we left her office, he wasn't striding 3 steps ahead anymore. He was walking slowly, shoulders tight, eyes unfocused. That was the moment I realized the truth had finally landed where it needed to, and it wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, the tension in the office felt different. Not the usual strained politeness or quiet competition, but something sharper, heavier, like the entire floor was bracing for impact. I noticed immediately that Brennan's office lights were off. His door was closed. His calendar, when I checked it, had been changed to out of office, indefinite. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Yesterday's meeting wasn't something he could charm or bluff his way out of. But deep down, I also knew the truth I'd sent wasn't the full truth. Not yet. There were things I hadn't included. Pieces of the puzzle I'd saved because even I wasn't sure how far this should go. And the part I kept circling back to was a single email Brennan had accidentally forwarded to me last July. It was a message to a prospective client, one I had sourced, nurtured, and guided to early negotiations. In his email, he wrote, "I've spent several months building this relationship, confident we're close to securing this." I remembered staring at that line for a long time, knowing full well I'd first contacted that client just 2 weeks earlier. At the time, I didn't react. I didn't send it to anyone. I just created a separate archive folder and filed the message away, unsure whether it would ever matter. Now, watching Brennan's dark office, it mattered. Because what I had submitted so far documented discrepancies. What I hadn't submitted documented intent. That was an entirely different battlefield. During lunch, I sat in my car again, the same spot where I had eaten countless rushed meals between client calls. I opened the folder on my phone and scrolled through the forwarded emails. 4 more just like that July message. 4 moments where Brennan had claimed, explicitly in writing, to have spent months or weeks developing relationships I had built myself. 5 emails, 5 lies, 5 timestamps that contradicted his narrative. And the more I read them, the more the anger settled into something resolute. Because yesterday, after the meeting with Marina, I'd overheard whispers from another team. Soft, cautious comments about how Brennan always did that, and how he knew how to make himself look good. Yet no one had ever said anything, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think it would matter. He had friends upstairs. He had influence. He had the confidence of someone who believed he would always be protected. But protection doesn't survive evidence, especially not this kind. That afternoon, as I walked back through the office doors, I made a choice I hadn't fully committed to before. I opened my draft email to Marina, the one I'd written the night before, and attached the 5 messages. I added one line. These communications may be relevant to determining intent. I hovered over the send button for several seconds. My heartbeat was steady, my breathing calm. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity. I clicked send at 10:47 a.m. Exactly 12 minutes later, Marina replied, "Received. This changes scope. Please be available for follow-up today?" The storm moved quickly after that. At 3 p.m., I walked into a conference room where Marina waited with Elliot and a woman I had never met, Naomi Sterling, Northcrest's general counsel. They asked precise questions, they laid out timelines. They compared my documentation to the forwarded emails and to the bonus submissions Brennan had filed. Naomi's expression didn't move, but the tightening in her jaw revealed everything she thought. When they dismissed me nearly an hour later, I returned to my desk to find the office unusually quiet. Then at 5:15, an email from Brennan hit the whole team. "I will be taking a temporary leave of absence while we resolve administrative matters." People looked around, whispering behind hands, glancing at me, then looking away. I didn't react. I just shut down my computer and gathered my things, feeling the weight of the day settle into something final. The truth hadn't just surfaced, it had teeth now. And for the first time, Brennan was the one running from it. By Friday morning, the shift in the building was undeniable. People spoke in hushed tones, moved carefully, glanced toward the executive floor as if waiting for a verdict they already suspected. My inbox held a meeting request from Marina for 9 a.m., and the moment I stepped into the room, I knew something irreversible had happened. She didn't draw it out. She told me directly, plainly, almost gently, that Northcrest had completed its internal review and that the evidence, my documentation, the email server logs, the metadata from Brennan's messages, had revealed a 3-year pattern of deliberate misrepresentation. His total inflated bonus compensation exceeded $2 million. The board had voted unanimously to terminate him for cause. Legal recovery efforts had already begun. I sat there absorbing the words, not triumphant, not relieved, just still. Marina then did something I didn't expect. She offered me a role I had once dreamed about. Director of Client Strategy, a guaranteed 30% salary increase, equity, and a direct reporting line to her. A clean slate, a leadership path, the recognition I had earned 100 times over. But as she spoke, all I could think about was what staying would mean. I would forever be the woman who brought down her boss. Some would see strength, others would see betrayal, and every success afterward would be questioned, quietly or not. That wasn't the foundation I wanted my future built on. So I thanked her, sincerely, and declined. Over the weekend, I packed the last of my personal files, sorted through years of notes and reminders, and prepared for my final week. When I returned on Monday, the atmosphere had thawed. Some colleagues approached me with quiet gratitude. Others avoided eye contact, unsure where they stood. I didn't blame them. People choose safety over truth more often than not. But on my last day, as I turned in my badge and stepped out onto the sidewalk, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: ease. 3 days later, Vestmark called. Their CEO had heard about my meticulous documentation and wanted to speak with me about a senior role on their corporate development team. They offered me 25% more than I'd made at Northcrest and a clear path to VP. I accepted. 6 months passed before I heard the final update. Northcrest recovered close to $1 million from Brennan through settlement. His reputation in the industry disintegrated. He left the state, and me? I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. The truth had simply fallen exactly where it belonged. In the end, what I learned isn't wrapped in triumph or some perfect sense of justice. It's something quieter, something more honest. When you're stuck in a place where your work is taken for granted and your voice is treated like background noise, it's easy to believe you're powerless. But the truth is, power often lives in the quiet things. The consistency you show up with, the boundaries you draw, the proof you keep even when no one's paying attention. People who thrive on manipulation count on others staying silent. They count on exhaustion, fear, politeness. And for a long time, I played along because I convinced myself it wasn't worth disrupting the peace. But documenting my work, standing by the truth, and refusing to let someone rewrite my story, that was the turning point. Brennan didn't crumble because I was loud or vengeful. He crumbled because the truth was undeniable when someone finally laid it out. And that's a lesson I carry now. You don't always need a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes not saying a single unnecessary word is what finally forces consequences to land where they should. In your own life, remember this. Protect your work. Honor your effort. Don't shrink yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. And don't underestimate the strength of the quiet choices, the boundaries, the documentation, the courage to walk away. How to get started today. Write down what you've achieved this month, every task, win, and contribution. Set one boundary with someone who has crossed a line too many times. Revisit your goals and ask yourself if your current environment supports them. If not, start exploring your next step. If you've ever been through something like this, or if this story reminded you of your own workplace battles, share your experience in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and pass this along to someone who might need it.